Gracias por acompañarnos en esta sección del ciclo de conferencias de la Cátedra José Gaos 2023, que como saben está a cargo del profesor Franz Berto. Esta semana tendremos las últimas dos conferencias de este ciclo y bueno, pues ha venido, pues digamos, dirigiendo su exposición justamente para llegar a esto que será el punto culminante de su propuesta. Y el título de su charla de hoy es Indicative Conditionals, Probabilities and Relevance. Muchas gracias, Fran.
Thank you. Okay, so this is joint work with a booker. I think I mentioned her at the outset. She's, to put it mildly, one of the coolest logicians in the world, and a rising star. She's also my favorite co-author. So I'm going to talk about conditionals. Indicative conditionals, so not conditionals in the subjunctive mood. Like if it were the case that P, then it would be the case that Q, or if it had been the case that P, then it would have been the case that Q. We're going to talk about if P then Q, okay? And that's a difficult topic. Not only because philosophers have been disagreeing on what the indicative if may mean for like 2,500 years back to the old Stoics, but also because nowadays, I mean, you can say philosophy disagree on anything, so yeah. But the indicative conditional is so controversial that there's a number of people who think that it doesn't even express a proposition. It doesn't even have a truth value. So we're going to talk about this today, and we're going to talk about probabilities, and I will try to show you that my beloved topics or subject matters have a lot of work to do in this ballpark as well. So I think I mentioned to you to begin with the famous or infamous Ramsey test. There's this mythical footnote in General Propositions of Causality, I think, by Ramsey, in which Ramsey comes up with an idea which later on has been labeled the Ramsey test. And why is it called the test? Because Ramsey says something like, well, how do we test a conditional? Okay, we test a conditional by hypothetically adding the antecedent to our stock of beliefs, okay, minimally adjusting our beliefs to maintain consistency in the light of the hypothetical addition, and we check the status of the consequent, okay? So we basically assess the consequent under the supposition of the antecedents, okay, or by hypothetically adding the antecedent to our belief system. That's kind of the rough idea, which has been relabeled as the Ramsey test. And there's few theses or hypotheses which are connected to the Ramsey test, which have been proposed after Ramsey, and which try to capture the core of the Ramsey proposal. A very famous one is called Adams' thesis. It's super popular, especially among philosophers. It's due to Adams, and it says the following: the acceptability of a simple indicative conditional, if I then psi. Simple just means no conditionals or indicatives embedded in the antecedent or in the consequent. Okay, so no nested indicatives in there. Okay, that's a simple indicative. And the acceptability of that equals the corresponding conditional probability. Okay, so the idea is an indicative conditional is acceptable for us to the extent that the probability of the consequent conditional on the antecedent, that's just a notation for conditional probability. Given the antecedent is high, okay? So the probability of psi given phi, or the probability of psi conditional on phi. When that's high, the conditional is very acceptable for us. When that's low, the conditional is not very acceptable for us, okay? And that makes sense, right? Because the idea is, well, take, I don't know, if it's sunny, I'm playing football, okay? That's my indicative. That sounds very acceptable to me when it's very likely that I'm playing football, conditional on it being sunny, right? And that's how we assess it. We suppose that it's sunny. We don't really believe that it's sunny, but we may be uncertain. We may not know. We don't know. Maybe completely uncertain whether it's sunny or not. But we just suppose that it's sunny, and we check how likely we find that we're playing football under this supposition. Okay. These are always going to be probabilities understood subjectively. Okay, so these are going to be degrees of belief degrees of confidence, something like that. Good. So that's Adam's thesis. That is sometimes confused, but it should not be confused with another thing, which is actually very different. It's called Steinecker's hypothesis, also called the equation. I think it's Dorothy Edgerton called it that way, the equation. That's the code. That's the code of everything according to Edgerton and some other people. Okay. That one says, Steinecker's hypothesis, that the probability of an indicative if prime and psi equals the conditional probability. Okay. So there's few differences between one and the other. This one is restricted to simple conditionals, the other one is not. This one is formulated in terms of acceptability, the other one is only formulated in terms of probabilities, understood subjectively, okay? Degrees of belief or degrees of confidence, and so on. You may say, well, what's acceptability if it is separated from believability, okay, or subjective likelihood, and so on? What is it to find a claim acceptable, if not to find it very likely? Okay. But the distinction is important because we'll come back to this a few times. There's a number of people, as I anticipated already, who believe that conditionals do not express propositions and they do not have truth values. So we should not properly talk about believability for these things, because to believe a claim is to believe that it's true. And in order for us to be able to believe that a claim is true, we need to take it as truth evaluable, to be capable of having a truth value. But according to these people, that includes Edgerton, Adams, Jonathan Bennett, and a few other people. That's actually lots of other people. They don't express propositions, so they cannot be true or false, or at least they don't have a complete truth table. So we should not properly say that they are believable, but they can be acceptable. Okay, and acceptable means more or less that we are disposed to do certain things with them. So when I find a conditional acceptable and I believe the antecedent, I'm disposed to believe the consequent, because that's just modus ponens. Okay, good. Okay, so Adam's thesis is quite popular in philosophy. Steinecker's hypothesis is popular in psychology, the psychology of reasoning. There's a whole new paradigm, psychology of reasoning, which is based on a so-called suppositional probabilistic account of indicatives. Okay. So philosophers generally believe that Steinecker's hypothesis cannot be quite right. Why? Well, because Lewis in 1976 came up with that nice, lovely little paper. That's one of the many papers that show what a genius Lewis was. Probabilities of conditionals and conditional probabilities. Where he said, well, if you assume that the probability of a conditional equals the corresponding conditional probability, then you trivialize the whole thing, because the only probability assignments for this that can work are trivial. They're the ones such that the probability of any conditional is going to be the same as the probability of the consequent for any conditional. And that's crazy, of course, right? There have been lots of further triviality results after Lewis due to Hayek and other people. Okay. And that's just a mathematical result. So philosophers just take it on board and say, well, that doesn't hold. Okay. But by endorsing Adam's thesis rather than Steinecker's hypothesis, people who believe that indicatives do not express propositions can insist that indicatives can be handled probabilistically, because say, well, they don't express propositions, so they cannot generally be embedded, and that's why they endorse Adam's thesis. So they're acceptable but not believable, properly speaking, and they cannot be embedded because they don't express propositions, so you can't embed them as you can embed a normal sentence that expresses a proposition and is not valuable. And that's how you can block the triviality results due to Lewis and others. So what was initially taken as a blow for this straightforward connection between the probability of conditionals and conditional probabilities actually has been reworked by these people. They say, well, fine. What the Lewisian results actually show is that conditionals just don't express propositions. Still, they are strictly correlated to conditional probabilities because we find one of them acceptable exactly to the extent that we find the corresponding conditional probability high. Good. Right. So So according to these people, generally indicatives lack truth values or they lack a complete truth table, and so they don't have probabilities of truth, properly so called, but they can have acceptability conditions which are given by Adam's thesis. Okay. Why do the psychologists of reasoning still like Stanaka's hypothesis? Well, because they weaken it. They say, well, it's not going to be identity, it's just a robust correlation. And indeed that is, because there are lots of experiments in the psychology of reasoning which show that lots of people find a conditional good just to the extent that they find the corresponding conditional probability high. Okay, so the psychologists of reasoning just say, well, we got lots of empirical results that show that these two things are correlated, short of being identical. Good. Now, Adam's thesis is supremely popular among philosophers, I told you, right? So, for instance, here's Don McGee, who says Adam's thesis describes what English speakers assert and accept with unfailing accuracy. And here's Jackson, right? Jackson, famous book on conditionals, where he says, there's a great deal of evidence for Adam's thesis. There is head-counting evidence. Very many philosophers of otherwise differing opinion have found Adam's thesis highly intuitive. There is case-by-case evidence. Take a conditional which is highly assertable, it will invariably be one whose antecedent is highly probable given the constant. Okay? So first thing, notice that they speak interchangeably of assertability or acceptability. Okay? But we want to keep them distinct. So acceptance is a mental state. It's an attitude that one can have towards a sentence. And it's performed in the privacy of our head. Okay? Assertion is a linguistic act. Okay? Of course, they correlate. Okay, but there are differences because, for instance, something may be very acceptable for us without being very assertable, right? Because it will be off topic or an inappropriate thing to say. It may be very acceptable for me. I don't know, that pure Aryan Germans have a superior race because I'm a racist, but that's not very acceptable. Okay, but if you start saying that around, I'll be back to that. Okay, so. Lots of philosophers find Adam's thesis very, very robust, but it's false. It's wrong. So there are theoretical considerations that speak against it, and even more dangerously, there are empirical results that speak against Adam's thesis. Theoretical considerations: a conditional probability, the probability of psi given phi, or conditional on phi, for an indicative that we find very unacceptable, okay, that conditional probability can be high, well, because psi, the consequent, was already quite likely, and it has nothing to do with phi. So supposing psi is just as likely, and it was likely already, doesn't make any difference. For instance, if Brexit causes a recession, then Jupiter is a planet. Consequent is very likely already. There are a lot of confidence in that. But when we judge the conditional probability of the consequent on the antecedent, still just as high, but that conditional is not very acceptable, is it? Right? One may say, well, maybe one is unacceptable because the consequent has probability 1. We may be completely confident in the truth of the consequent, and we assign probability 1. Sometimes people who work with probability say, well, be careful before you commit fully to any empirical claim. Okay? Never assign probability 1. Even when you have overwhelming evidence, yeah, you may want to assign 0.95 and so on. But maybe you assign probability 1 to this one, and conditionals whose antecedent or consequent have extreme probabilities, well, they behave in a weird way. We will come back to that later. Okay, so you may have this line of defense, but that's not going to work because conditionals with high, but less than 1, consequent probability can be very unacceptable when this has little to do with the antecedent. Take 2. If Brexit causes a recession, then there will be some heads in the first 100 tosses of this fair coin. Now, we judge the consequent very lightly, right? Because it's a fair coin, so it's very likely that if you toss it 100 times, at least once it's going to be heads, okay? But we're not completely confident, because you never know, you may have a very unlikely sequence in which it comes out tails 100 times, even if it's a fair coin. So the consequent has a very high probability, but not 100% probability. And also it has a very high probability conditional on the antecedent. But it looks very unacceptable. Okay, good. There's some empirical considerations against Adam's thesis. So Igor Duvin and Verbrugge, stubborn Dutch researchers who work in formal approaches to conditional and the psychology of reasoning, they carried out experiments. So they got two groups of subjects and they gave them a little bit of context. So basically they gave them up to 30 short stories, creating a context, describing a possible situation. And then one of the two groups was asked to rate the acceptability of conditionals if phi and psi in their respective contexts. The other group got the same context of short stories, and they were asked to judge the probability of the consequent on the supposition of the antecedent. Okay, so two groups, same stories. One group is asked, oh, how acceptable is the conditional? The other group is asked, well, how likely is the consequent conditional on the antecedent? How high is the conditional probability of the consequent on the antecedent? And guess what? They gave very different results. People's patterns of acceptance or degrees of acceptance for conditionals generally don't even approximate the corresponding conditional probabilities. Okay? There's not even a correlation. And Duvin and other people rightly concluded, quoting Igor, he has a beautiful book on the epistemology of indicative conditionals. Highly recommended. It says Igor that this kind of empirical result manifestly refutes Adam's thesis both in its strict form and in its approximate form. Okay? They don't even correlate the two of them. And that's right, because usually Adam's thesis is understood as a descriptive thesis. It's not supposed to capture what we ought to do with conditional. It's supposed to capture what we mostly do, but we don't. Good, so the next question is, well, what is wrong with Adam's thesis? If you compare the conditional 2 on the tossing of the coin above with this one, I'm adapting again an example from Igor. If there's some heads in the first 10 tosses, then there will be some heads in the first 100 tosses of this coin. Well, that sounds way better, right? We accept 3, not 2, because 3's antecedent is relevant for the concept. We need some rough intuitive sense of relevance, which instead is off topic with respect to the antecedent of 2. So there's a connection here which is missing there. That suggests a fixing, or the initial idea for a fixing. We accept a conditional to the extent that first, yeah, right, that's the Adam thesis part. The consequent is likely conditional on the antecedent, provided, and we add another condition, provided that some relevance or topicality connection linking antecedent and consequent is satisfied. This is what is missing in the case of irrelevant conditionals, whose consequent, however, is very likely conditional on the antecedent. Now, how one should work is very well understood. Okay, we've been doing probabilities, Bayesianism, probability logic, and also probabilistic accounts for conditionals for ages. So that's under control. Let's find two rich patterns, which holds the key to improve our understanding of indicative conditionals. Some people say, well, maybe that's just pragmatics, right? Conditionals that are associated to high conditional probabilities are just unassertable sometimes when there's a lack of connection between antecedent and consequent. But things are slightly more complicated. That was the old Gracian strategy, right? That was used even to say the idea that the indicative conditional as a content which is captured by the material conditional, right? That was where all of those crazy material conditionals are true, they're just unassertable, right? That was a pragmatic way out. That has been long debunked, so nearly nobody believes that. Even the main contemporary defender of that idea, that the indicative is the material conditional, that's Steve Williamson, even he doesn't believe that that strategy works. And anyway, things must be more complicated because there's a number of studies, including studies by Karolina Krzyzanowska and other people, which show that pragmatic discourse coherence, in the Gaussian sense, is a weaker constraint than relevance for indicative conditionals. Because in general, discourse coherence as a pragmatic constraint only requires not to assert, for instance, a conjunction when the two conjuncts have nothing to do with each other. Okay, you must come up with a very elaborate and convoluted conversational context to have a context where it's okay to assert Brexit will cause a recession and Jupiter is a planet. You can, of course, okay, but it's going to be a very roundabout story that you have to tell to come up with a context in which that's a pragmatically appropriate move to make. Why? Well, because the two conjuncts have nothing to do with each other in most contexts. But sometimes a conjunction is assertable because there is some, intuitively speaking, topic overlap between the two conjuncts. But even in those contexts, we very often don't want to assert the corresponding conditional. So here's an example from Carolina's work. So it could be, I don't know, a documentary from the National Geographic. Okay, raccoons, you're telling about raccoons. So raccoons have no wings, and also they cannot breathe underwater. That's perfectly fine in the context, right? Why? Well, the two conjuncts overlapping topic. They're both about raccoons, what they're like. But in the very same context, you don't want to assert the corresponding conditionals with antecedent consequent. If raccoons have no wings, then they cannot breathe underwater. That's bad, right? Here's an example from the Priest textbook, The Introduction to Non-Classical Logic. So Graham has this one. A fortune teller predicts that you will win the lottery, and as a matter of fact, you do. Okay, that's fine. The conjuncts overlapping topics. The topic may be something like you win the lottery. But it will be superstitious to accept the condition where even the fortune teller predicts that you win the lottery, then you do, right? You don't want to do that. Yeah, so this shows that a very famous inferential schema, also called, it's called and to if, so the inference from a conjunction to the corresponding indicative conditional, has to pay at least as acceptability preserving. Okay, that's also called centering, because if you buy the Stan-Nacker use semantics for conditional logics, okay, that comes out valid. Okay. So that's a valid inference from a conjunction to the corresponding condition. The idea is, well, when the antecedent is true and also the consequent is true, then the conditional holds. Okay, now maybe that is truth preserving, and maybe that's also a good inference in a probabilistic logic. And in fact, if you buy the the Adams probability logic for conditionals, okay, that's a valid inferential schema. But it doesn't look like it preserves acceptability. Sometimes a conjunction is acceptable, but the corresponding indicative conditional is not. Good. Now, how do we invalidate this? I'm focusing on this because that's the crucial thing that we need to capture in order to provide a good account of what relevance or topicality connection is for indicative conditionals, even in a probabilistic setting. So how can we invalidate that in some sense or other, or invalidate? There are some arguments which invalidate the and to if schema pretty naturally. They're called inferentialist accounts. Actually, the account that I'm proposing would be called inferentialist as well, because sometimes people generally call inferentialist any account of indicative conditionals which attaches a lot of importance to the relevant connection between antecedent and consequent. Okay? I think this is a bit of a misnomer because it's a bit too generic. I don't want to call the account that I will propose to you in a few minutes inferentialist. I think that the name should be saved for this specific family of accounts that I will explain to you now. And you'll see why these deserve to be called inferentialist properly. So these are approaches according to which conditionals express arguments in some anti-mimetic form. So a conditional if phi then psi expresses an argument in which not all the relevant premises are made explicit. That's an old idea from Mill, and that also was picked up by Ramsey. That's another claim that Ramsey makes. He says, we can say with Mill that if P then Q means that Q is inferable from P, that is, of course, from P together with certain facts and laws, not stated, but in some way indicated by the context. So according to these views, a conditional if phi then psi says something like this. It says, well, there's some good inference, there's some good argument from phi, the antecedent, and further background assumptions or premises which are not made explicit, okay, facts and laws, says Ramsey, let's say background assumptions to psi, okay. What the background assumptions are depends a lot on the antecedent. That's why I put the subscript there to remind you of that. So that's the idea. Okay. It's an old idea. It has some story and glory. So the idea is when I say, oh, if the weather is nice, then I'm playing football, I'm saying something like, from the assumption that the weather is nice and further assumptions that I'm not gonna unpack for you now, but they're there, like I have an amount of free time, I don't have a broken leg, I'm in a good mood to play football, and blah, blah, blah. From all of this, it follows that there's a good argument to the effect that I'm playing football. That's what I'm saying, more or less, when I say, if the weather is nice, then I'm playing football. Okay. Good. Of course, there's no way to capture all conditionals in this way if we only restrict to good deductive arguments. There's no way that all the good conditionals are going to be the ones that correspond to deductive arguments. So these people understand argument more generally. Okay? So they say, well, psi, the consequent may follow from the antecedent phi and further background assumptions, deductively, inductively, by some inductive argument, abductively, whatever abduction turns out to be, or by a mixture of various ways of inferring. Okay. Otherwise, the account is not going to be general enough. And of course, in this account, and to if the inference from a conjunction to the corresponding conditional fails in an obviously natural way, right? Because the fact that phi and psi are true together, and so the conjunction is true, well, it doesn't warrant there being a good argument from the former and background assumption to the latter, right? That's good. So it's a pretty natural way to make the and to if inference fail. Through antecedent, through consequent, that's not enough to have a good argument from the antecedent and for the premises to the consequent. So that's pretty neat. What are the problems with this family of accounts? One problem is that, well, it's dubious that all relevant conditionals express the existence of some argument from that antecedent that contextually determine background assumption to their consequent. Surely, it's in agreement with the Ramsey test to say that their assessment always involves some form of mental simulation, supposition, or whatever, whereby we assess the consequent under the supposition of the antecedent. But to ladder the process inferential in all cases, just because of this, would be to stretch beyond usefulness. Surely, any conditional clearly says that its consequent follows in some sense or other from its antecedent. Another problem is that modus ponens fails for condensed arguments involving inductive or abductive steps, right? Because you can have good arguments, which are good as inductive arguments or abductive arguments, but they're not deductively good. Okay, so they can be good arguments in an inductive or abductive sense, even though there are possible situations where all the premises are true and the conclusion is false, right? So you can have a good conditional if phi and psi, and all the premises of the corresponding argument are true, in particular phi, but the conclusion psi is false. So modus ponens goes out of the window here. And that's bad, right? I mean, I'm an old classical logician, so I'm open to any suggestion. But I mean, preserving truth of whatever you want your logic to preserve, if it's not true, like degrees of probability, acceptability, whatever you want to be preserved by your logic, forwards from the antecedent to the consequent is taken as a minimal requirement for a condition. Okay, there are putative exceptions. My good friend JC he came up with a story to the effect that modus ponens must fail. But even JC thinks that that only happens with peculiar cases like the liar, right? And even in the McGee cases, you may know McGee came up with that very famous paper, counterexample to modus ponens. Even he thinks that the counterexamples never show up when you only work with simple conditionals. He says that himself. So quoting him, he says, this is famous, if Reagan doesn't win the election and so on, right? That's a nested conditional, the one he proposes. And he himself says, there's every reason to suppose that restricted to simple conditionals, modus ponens is unacceptable, okay? So throwing modus ponens out of the window is a bad move. Good inductive or adaptive arguments can fail to be truth preserving, and they're wise when, and so should be the conditional condensing them. But that's in conflict with the fact that if there's one inferential scheme that people generally get right, is modus ponens. Okay, if there's 97% endorsement, I have no idea what the remaining 3% is thinking, but that's high. It's way better than modus tollens, notoriously. Okay, people perform way worse with modus tollens than with modus ponens. Good. Here's another proposal that makes the end-to-if inference fail very natural. It's called the evidential support thesis. It's due to Igor Duvin. So in this approach, relevance is taken as probabilistic evidential support. That's a famous account of probabilistic support. So in this, you say that phi is evidence for psi by making it more likely, right? So what does it mean that phi is evidence for psi? Well, psi had a certain probability, okay, and phi bumps up the probability of psi. That's a way of understanding what phi is evidence for psi may mean. That has been around since Carnap and the new positivists. So Truman gives the qualitative non-graded acceptability conditions for indicatives in the following way. He says, well, maybe that's how it works. If phi then psi is acceptable when two things happen. First, the corresponding conditional probability meets a certain threshold. Okay, so the probability of the consequent conditional of the antecedent reaches a certain probabilistic threshold. Okay. And second, psi is probabilistic evidence of phi. So the first condition is a qualitative variant of Adam's thesis, and the second condition says psi is more likely conditional on phi than it is unconditional. Okay, right? So this one is what captures probabilistic relevance. Okay, this one is required because sometimes the conditional probability is very low anyway, and then you don't find the conditional acceptable. Okay, so it may be that the fact that the weather is good makes it more likely that I'm playing football, but hey, I have a broken leg. So it's still very unlikely that if the weather is nice, I'm playing football. Okay, that's what the first condition is there to fix. And to rephrase again, naturally, phi and psi can be true and acceptable without phi raising a bit the probability of psi. So it phases very naturally also in this context. But what's the problem with this? One problem is that Truman's Igor's account is very inferentially weak. He has a probabilistic logic, and all of these things will come out in valid modus ponens, conjunction in the consequent. So that's the inferential schema which says when you have if phi then psi, if phi then chi, then you can conjoin the consequence. If phi then if psi and chi. Okay. So if the weather is nice, I'm going to play football. And if the weather is nice, I'm gonna have fun with my friends. So if the weather is fine, then I'm gonna play football and have fun with my friends. It sounds very good. But it doesn't have constant monotonicity. If phi then psi, if phi then chi, it follows that if phi and psi then chi. That's another very natural one that phase. And constant transitivity. If phi then psi, if phi and psi then chi, it follows that if phi then chi. Okay. All of these hold in the Adams probabilistic logic. They also hold in the Stalnaker possible word semantics for the conditional, but they fail here. Also, the evidential support thesis doesn't fare well with conditionals with extreme probabilities. So, extreme probability of the antecedent of the consequent, because well, if the probability of phi is 0, then phi can hardly be evidence for anything. That's what most people think. I'm not completely sure. Actually, I don't buy this view, but if you buy that view, then that's a problem. If the probability of psi is 1, nothing can bump it up, right? Then any conditional if phi and psi with 0 antecedent probability of 1 consequent probability turns out to be unacceptable, but that doesn't seem to be always the case. Many such conditionals, which ones? Well, the relevant ones sound perfectly acceptable in a number of contexts. Now, I myself, in spite of what a number of people think, including Bennett, I think that you can non-trivially assess indicatives whose antecedent you fully take to be false. That's not a mainstream view, so I will sell you some propaganda for this, okay? Because I really like the view. You can be totally certain that Oswald killed Kennedy, okay? You may have been the Zapruder guy who was filming the whole thing, okay? You may have been standing in front of Kennedy when he got shot and you saw the whole thing, okay? You're completely confident. Still, you have no trouble assessing if Oswald didn't kill Kennedy, then someone else did. Unpretentious thinkers can suppose, not in the counterfactual mode, but in the indicative mode that phi, also when they fully disbelieve psi. So I completely buy the story told by James Joyce, not that Joyce, another one, who wrote a beautiful book called Foundations of Causal Decision Theory, okay, where he says, it is often assumed that any form of probabilistic belief revision, which involves rising the dead by increasing the probabilities of certainly false propositions, must involve counterfactual beliefs. This is not so. It is logically consistent both to be certain that some proposition is false and yet to speculate about what the world is like if one is in fact wrong. To be subjectively certain of something is, after all, not the same as regarding oneself infallible on the matter. That was even for conditionals whose antecedents are taken by us as necessarily false. Take 8 and 9. 8, if all even numbers are prime and 5 is even, then 5 is prime. 9, if all even numbers are prime and 5 is even, then one cannot square the circle. Okay. Now 8 sounds very acceptable, at least to me. 9 doesn't sound acceptable at all. Why? Well, because there's a relevant connection missing for 9. Where the connection is there for 8. That shows, of course, that the acceptability/assertability conditions for indicatives are hyper-intentional. Why? Well, because the antecedent of these two have the same intention, they have the same world, none of them. The consequent of 8 and also the consequent of 9 are co-intentional, they also do have the same world. Okay? But one is acceptable, the other one is not, so acceptability is hyper-intentional. Now, if you want to have a non-trivial acceptability conditions for indicatives to whose antecedent you assign probability 0, you need to rework your treatment of probabilities a little bit, but that's an easy technical fix. Well, why? Because in the standard account, you define conditional probabilities in terms of unconditional one. That's the famous ratio formula. So you define the probability of psi given phi as the ratio, right? It's the ratio between the probability of phi and psi and the probability of phi. But that ratio, of course, is undefined when this is 0, right? So you need to change something. But the fix is easy. It's not a problem for people like me who buy the Joyce view. It's a problem for a treatment of conditionals that resolves to that way of dealing with conditional probabilities. And there's an easy technical fix. You can use Popper functions or Popper any function. They've been around thanks to Popper and other people since the 60s. So you basically, instead of defining conditional probability as a ratio of unconditional ones, you just take conditional probability as primitive. And you reformulate the Kolmogorov axioms for probability just by using conditional probabilities. And then you can define plain probability as probability conditional on a triviality, like a logical truth. Okay. So the unconditional probability of phi just is the conditional probability, the probability of phi conditional on a logical truth. Okay, now I'm going to start to present to you my view, the view that I have elaborated together with a book. And remember, we are after this kind of characterization. We accept if phi then psi to the extent that first, the corresponding condition of probability psi, provided that's the condition that I propose we add to fix Adam's thesis, which is wrong in itself, okay? Provided phi is relevant for psi. So the antecedent is relevant with respect to the consequent. And guess what? I'm going to understand the relevance as topic sensitivity. A relevant conditional is one whose consequent is about the right topic, as contextually determined by the antecedent. So the degree of acceptability of a phi and psi is given first, as per Adam's thesis, by the corresponding condition of probability. And now I'm using capital P because these are going to be proper functions, okay? There's going to be the usual probabilities. Provided second that the conditional is on topic, otherwise, if phi and psi is just unacceptable. And that's going to capture those intuitions that I explored at the beginning of the talk. So conditional is on topic when, that's how it's going to work, its consequent is fully included, not just in the topic of the antecedent, it's going to be a bit more complicated here, in topic contextually determined by the antecedent. Intuitively, that's the topic of the relevant background assumptions determined by phi in context where phi itself is one of the relevant assumptions. So why am I not saying just simply, oh, the topic of the consequent must be included in that of the antecedent? Why am I saying, oh, the topic of the consequent must be included in the topic of the relevant assumptions contextually determined by the antecedent? Why this more complicated formulation, which is a bit of a mouthful? Well, because, well, sometimes we accept an indicative without there being any obvious direct topic inclusion between antecedent and consequent, right? Because we say things like this, and these sound very acceptable. If we keep burning fossil fuels at this pace, then the polar ice will melt. If Brexit causes a recession, then the Tories won't win the next election. Yeah, I don't know. If you push the button, then the engine will start. Okay. In all of these cases, there's an obvious sense in which the antecedent is relevant for the consequent, but unless you have a very generous idea of topicality, it doesn't on its own address an issue with respect to which the consequent is for your topic. I mean, that depends a bit on how you want to understand subject matters. We've already been through this in previous weeks. I told you that some people are very generous and context flexible on what counts as a subject matter of a sentence in a relevant context, okay? Especially people who approach subject matters, first of all, by the questions to which the sentence can be taken as an answer and so on. There's other people who want to connect subject matters more strictly to what the sentence is explicitly about, okay? If you have that narrow and stricter conception of subject matter, you need to go for this more elaborate setting that I'm proposing to you. Then the supposition of the antecedents in our assessment of conditionals, of indicatives, triggers background assumptions, activates background assumptions, with respect to which the consequent is fully off topic. For instance, for one, fossil fuel burning topic, triggers topics such as the emission of CO2, rising global temperatures, and so on. Okay. Now things are going to be formally complicated because I'm going to make things precise. I'm going to give you a formal language, and I'm going to give you a probabilistic treatment for it. So it's going to be a probability logic, which is also topic sensitive. So if you have no taste for formal stuff, sorry. If you have, so take that as a bonus for those of you who have more taste for formal stuff. So, okay, here we go. Start with a single propositional language with propositional variables, PQ, and so on, and just negation and conjunction for the connectives. We're going to define the other truth functional connectives, the usual way out of them. We work for formulas, other propositional variables, not phi, and phi and psi when I would find formulas. We identify the language with a set of well-formed formulas, and we're going to use the usual abbreviations for conjunction, disjunction, the material conditional, which is not if, okay, the English if. That's not complicated. Material equivalence of biconditional is just conjoined with material conditionals. T stands for an arbitrary tautology, P not P. And bottom is the negation of top. Okay. we call the elements of this language Boolean sentences for obvious reasons. Next, for any formula in this language, I'm going to use this notation, var find. So var find stands for the set of propositional variables that show up in phi. Okay. So if in phi you have p, q, and r, var phi is the set whose members are exactly p, q, and r. Okay. And then I use this notation for classical logical truth / consequence, okay, defined just on error. Okay, so that just be classical propositional logic. Okay. Next, I'm going to expand that language into our conditional language, CL. That's a language that extends our starting Boolean language, L, by an indicative conditional, which connects only the elements of the Boolean language. That's in order to avoid nested conditionals, right? So you cannot nest. The only well-formed conditionals are things of the form if I am psi, with no conditionals nested in phi or psi. The well-formed formulas in the conditional language are the well-formed formulas of the original one, and if I am psi, whenever phi and psi are in the starting language. Okay, so no nested conditionals. So we want to have an account which is compatible with what non-propositionalists on indicatives think. You cannot pre-embed conditions. Okay, that's just a definition of proper function. You just rephrase the Kolmogorov principles, taking conditional probabilities primitive. I'm going to get there. Proper functions allow for non-trivial conditionalization on zero probabilities. Okay. You just, as I said, you can define the plain probability of phi as the probability of phi conditional on tautology. And you can have that is zero. Still, the probability of psi conditional on phi is well defined. Next, that's just technical stuff. So I'm going to be quick. We call an element phi of the basic language abnormal with respect to a certain proper function P when the probability of eta conditional on phi is 1 for any formula eta in the starting language and normal otherwise. That's just to get the technicalities going. Topic model, that's not news because I already bothered you with this stuff last week and the week before. And a topic model T is just a tuple which is made of 4 things. The first item T is our usual non-empty set of possible topics. Okay, these are just what the formulas of our language can be about. They're subject matters. And as usual, I'm going to have a very abstract and non-committal treatment. I'm not going to say you anything on what topics are. They're all only going to obey the structural constraints that you are already familiar with from last week and the week before. I'm going to use variables A, B, C, and so on, range over possible topics. The second item in the topic model is the usual binary idempotent commutative associative operation. We talked about that. It's that operation that takes the topics and merges them together. And it's always defined. And you can, as usual, again, define topic part 2 as usual. You define what it means that topic A is part of topic B by saying that the fusion of A and B is just B. And that's going to be a partial order again. The third item is a topic function. You're already familiar with this one as well from the previous weeks. It starts by assigning a topic to each propositional variable, and then it's extended to the whole language by taking the topic of a sentence phi as the fusion of the elements in bar phi, the fusions of the topics of the atomic formulas that show up in the sentence. Okay? So the topic of phi is the fusion over the topics of the atoms that show up in the formula. Okay. That's just the usual trick, which allows us to have the topic transparency of the connectives. Okay, so negation, conjunction, disjunction, so on, they're about nothing. And the final item is a function on topics. That's a new bit. I need to unpack this. That's a Kuratowski closure operator, technically. So it satisfies the following conditions for all topics. Okay, inclusion, idempotence, and additivity. Inclusion guarantees that the topic of our background assumptions always includes that of the antecedent that triggers the conditional supposition. So A is going to be included in the output of the function for A. Idempotent says that those assumptions are complete in the sense that when you look at the background assumptions divided by 5, that doesn't lead to new background assumptions. So once you've applied it once, if you apply it again, you get nothing new. Okay. And additivity is just to ensure that that function interacts with fusion in the proper way. Okay. It just says that the topic of the background assumptions determined by 5 is the same as the fusion of the topics of the relevant background assumptions determined by the more cryptic components. So what you get when you apply to what you get when you apply the operator to the fusion of A and B is the same as what you get when you first apply the operator to A, you apply it to B, and then you lump them. Okay. Next, here's when a conditional is on topic, if item psi is on topic with respect to a certain model, when the topic of psi is included in the Kuratowski closure of the topic of phi. And it's on topic simpliciter when it's an on topic conditional with respect to every model. So that's what makes a conditional relevant and acceptable. It's on topic in the sense that the topic of the consequent is included in the topic contextually determined by the antecedent given by the Kuratowski closure. Okay, it's just a topological closure operator, right? If you're familiar with that kind of stuff. It's just in the topological closure of the antecedent, of the topic of the antecedent, that the topic of the consequent needs to be included. And now we can define the graded acceptability or unacceptability conditions for the formulas of the conditional language, in particular for our indicatives. For any proper function P and topic model T defined on the language, the degree of acceptability of an element of the language is defined as follows. For any formula in the original Boolean language, okay, the acceptability is just a probability. Okay. And this is the unconditional probability in the sense that it's just conditional probability on a tautology. Okay. So acceptability for the Boolean bits of the language is just a subjective probability. And that's the crucial bit. This is the acceptability for indicative conditional. The first thing is what recaptures the Adam thesis, because it says, well, it's the same as the corresponding conditional probability when it's a non-topic conditional. So the topic of the consequent is included in the topological or Kuratowski closure of that of the antecedent. Otherwise, it's plainly unacceptable. So you can define unacceptability from acceptability. That's just down to probability logic the way Adams did it, okay, in terms of unacceptability. Well, yes, what's a probabilistically good argument? It's good when the conditional is no more unacceptable than the unacceptability of the premises. So you don't become more unacceptable when you move from the premises to the conclusion, right? So the conclusion doesn't bring down the probability with respect to the premises. That's intuitive idea. So the degree of unacceptability is just 1 minus the degree of acceptability. So yeah, that's the code. The degree of acceptability of an indicative conditional if phi and psi is just the probability of psi conditional of phi, as per Adams' thesis. And then we got our fix. As long as second, if phi and psi is a non-topic indicative. Otherwise, if it's off topic, it's just unacceptable, even though the corresponding conditional probability is super high, which is what we were trying to capture. And the degree of acceptability of a Boolean sentence is just the probability of that condition on a triviality. Next, we can define probabilistic validity to set of formulas gamma, delta. That's a valid probabilistic inference if and only for any proper function P and topic model. Guess what? The sum of the unacceptability of the premises is at least as equal, but not bigger than, is more than or equal to the unacceptability of the conclusion. Okay. So unacceptability doesn't bump up when you go from the premises to the conclusion. Yeah, and we say that a bunch of formulas is valid, just in case the unacceptability is 0 for all the items there. And invalid otherwise. Now in this setting, and to rephrase, very naturally. Okay, that's what we wanted to fail. Because difference from phi and psi to if phi and psi can fail to be acceptability preserving due to topicality constraints. The latter may be an off-topic conditional, like the example number 5 that I gave above. If raccoons have no wings, then they cannot breathe underwater, even though the former is through an acceptable conjunction, like our 4. Raccoons have no wings and they cannot breathe underwater. Although the conjuncts plausibly overlapping topic, they're both about raccoons, which makes the conjunction coherent and sensible in discourse. The topic of raccoons cannot breathe underwater is not fully included in that of the background assumptions contextually triggered by raccoons have no wings. Now, there's a bunch of validities in the logic. That one is fine, but if I am psi, better be. We got no exponents. We got all the things which were invalid in the Dubin setting, including conjunction in the consequent, cautious transitivity, cautious monotonicity, and so on. So our logic is strong enough, so we claim. But there's lots of invalidities, and those are due to the fact that our probabilistic logic is weaker than the Adams probabilistic logic. Why? Because we have the topicality constraints. We ask for more in order for a conditional to be good. And again, I'm not going to read them all, but the important thing is this. It's hyperintentional. So look at this U, just this U. That's replacement of equivalent in the antecedent or in the consequent of a conditional. That holds in the Stanaker conditional logic. It holds in the Adams probabilistic logic for conditionals. It says, this is phi and psi are materially equivalent. And that's a theorem of classical propositional logic. So of course they are co-intentional. Still, it's not the case that when you replace either with the other in the antecedent of our conditional, you get equivalent forms. Say for the consequent. If phi and psi, phi if and only if psi, theorems of classical propositional logic. So of course they get the same intension. Still, when you replace one with the other in the consequent of our conditional, you don't get equivalent formulas. Okay? So you get a hyperintentional acceptability conditions, which is what we wanted. Remember I told you examples that I gave you above. Sometimes co-intentional antecedent, co-intentional consequent for two indicatives, but one is acceptable, the other one is not. So these better fail. Also, it may be that phi entails psi in classical propositional logic. Still, the corresponding indicative is not a theorem of our logic. Now, in a paper with a book here, and also in chapter 8 of the Topics of Thought book, we argue that the closure principles which are validated and invalidated by our logic are both theoretical and plausible, and in line with empirical results on how people reason with conditionals. Okay. There's a bunch of further tests carried out by Igor Bilfen, which show that the inferences that come out valid are inferences which have a high degree of endorsement by competent speakers. And the inferences that come out invalid are inferences which have a low degree of endorsement by competent speakers. So we say, yeah, that's good for us. Our logic fares well with Bilfen's experimental results. Yeah, that's what I just said. I should say something on, it does a better job than Adams' thesis of tracking relevance, of course, in particular the hyperintentional components. I should say something, I didn't say that earlier, on why I'm talking so much about what people do and don't do in experiments, because I haven't done that in previous talks. Why am I doing that now? Well, because in previous talks, I only talk about truth conditions, and so on, and semantic contents. And you may say, well, we don't care about what people think there. We care about the truth conditions, right? We care about semantic contents. But now, I've been talking for the whole talk about the acceptability of indicatives. I didn't tell you about the truth conditions. For all I told you, non-propositionalists like Bennett and Edgington and so on, maybe you're right that conditionals don't express propositions, they don't have truth conditions and so on. Okay, I only gave you a logic for the acceptability conditions of conditionals. Okay, and I think that when it's about acceptability, and you want to give a descriptive account of acceptability, then you better take people's intuitions or competent speakers' intuitions into account. That's why I've been talking to you about what kind of conditional people generally judge acceptable, what kind of inferences people generally judge good inferences, and so on. And I've been pointing at experimental results by Duman and other people. Okay? So I think that in this context, the experiments matter. Good. That's what I say. Thanks. You want to have the usual 10-minute break? Yeah. You need it, right?
Ya la fecha que solo
te mandamos un chat, pero no, seguro no lo
para mostrar normalmente una semana antes de que empiece el mes. Es decir, una semana antes de que febrero puedes mandar a preguntar verificarte y el nombre de la ponencia. Es suficiente. Así es el nombre de la ponencia. Puedes invitar ya sea de refugiados ya por una participación de mapas en texto para confiar pero sí luego hay personas que me mandan, o sea, nos mandan mandan a los replicantes el texto, la mera semana. Y normalmente una semana antes de que presenten, yo les mando regulaciones para una propuesta, una imagen para una propuesta de constitución. Ya si no encuentras a alguien que replique, los avisas y los traemos a los mismos de otro lugar. Ya si de plano no encuentras a un estudiante, pues puedes invitar a un
tengo unos 5 o 6 artículos más representativos de ella. Sí, igual el libro de más de 6 capítulos y es por 30 páginas, pues no sé qué no puedo. 30 páginas profesionales de no profesional. Genial. Sí, claro, me parece bien. Sí, era como acaba de explicar lo que pasa para la mujer. ¿Qué tan los lunes por la mañana?
So we have time for some questions and answers, and we have already a few raised hands. So we're going to start with Axel, please.
Oh, thank you. This was great, but I still have some doubts. This is not going to, how would it work? Or is it going to work for so-called vampire conditionals? Like, those, the literature is kind of crazy. Sometimes they call them vampire conditionals, something like, I have to read it. If England know what they're doing, then I'm monkey's uncle. Things like
that. Yeah, I know them by another name.
Okay. Doesn't
Attachment conditionals.
Oh, okay.
Because in English you often say, "Oh, if such and so, then I'm a Dutchman."
Okay.
Which is, and Puggy Gordoeven, who works on that, and he's Dutch, so he cannot say that, but I can say that. I don't know. How do you want them to be acceptable?
I would want them to be acceptable.
Okay.
Because people use them and people accept them.
So I claim that this account is not supposed to work with conditionals for which you don't want topicality requirement to hold. This account is not supposed to be for conditionals for which you do not want a relevance condition to hold. So not only for those, but also for Dutchman or vampire condition, whatever. Also so-called what's another name? Davis conditionals, concessive conditionals. So if you open the refrigerator, it will not explode. Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, what I want to convey is the idea that whether you open it or not, if you open it, it's not going to explode. If you don't open it, it's not going to explode. Okay. These are concessives.
Yes.
They go together with even before the antecedent or whether or not. Mm-hmm. So even if P, Q, or whether or not P, Q, they cannot take then in the consequent. Oh. It's not very felicitous to say if you open the refrigerator, then it will not explode, because then you seem to convey the idea that open it makes a difference. Okay? So you better open it, otherwise it's going to explode. Okay. They're exactly the ones for which Adam's thesis works. But they're a minority part in the condition, because mostly the conditions that we use are conditions that take then in the consequent, and that's a secure sign that we take the antecedent to be relevant for the consequent. So for those kinds of conditions, you just remove the additional conditions of the report, and then you give the Adams. What's crazy is that people know that the Adams criterion work for ordinary conditionals, whereas it doesn't. Yeah, it's the other way around.
Yeah. Can I ask also something? In the model also you have the acceptability of non-conditional just to be the proper.
Yeah.
But then you don't actually have further condition of sharing topicality.
Yeah, like that's just not model
conjunctions. So
no,
that's why you're gonna. So it. But then the way you're gonna get the rejection of from and to if then is gonna be because of that, right? Because there are no condition. Does it hold when you have a? Because I'm worried about the raccoon example, because in the raccoon example you do have topic sharing of topic, and if not on this one you can imagine what it does. But then if the F function has as one of the constraints that the conjunction the topic of the antecedent has to be contained in the F, then it would seem that for any conjunction that shares topic, you're going to be able to, you should be able to know when.
Because we have a little proof. I can find it this one. Okay, yeah. Let's just go. Okay, so these are cases in which there's only overlap between antecedent and consequent, right?
No, but yeah, that's what I say. I was thinking, just think.
If there's not overlap or inclusion,
Yeah, what if you happen to?
well, in those special cases, that's going to follow. It doesn't follow in general, so the inference is invalid.
Yeah, but we can imagine cases where we don't want that to happen if there is complete topic generally.
Come up with one.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll have to.
The
Yeah.
thing is, so there's another thing that I wanted to mention.
Okay.
Suppose I simplify the acceptability conditions for indicatives and I just say the topic of the consequent must be included in that of the antecedent. Okay, so plain topic inclusion, not the topic of the consequent is included in the topological closure. We have a proof that shows that it's exactly the same logic that you get. Okay, it doesn't make any difference with respect to the inferences which are validated by the logic. Okay. So the only reason we use the topological closure constraint rather than the plain inclusion constraint that it makes the semantics of the acceptability conditions for the indicatives more plausible. But that doesn't make any difference in the logic. Okay, so whenever you don't have full topic inclusion, you can be guaranteed that the conditional is not going to be acceptable anyway, because we have this precise correspondence between the sophisticated setting that I presented to you with a topological closure condition and a putative simple setting in which you just say the topic of the consequent must just be included in that of the antecedent.
Thank you.
Okay. Santiago comes next.
Thank you. I have a question about the relationship between your account and reasoning.
Right.
Because one might think that so can you go to the next slide? Yeah. So there is this current literature on what good reasoning is, where reasoning is understood as process. And many people like Conor McHugh and Jonathan Way would say that reasoning from 5 to 5 is bad reasoning. So they think that understood as a process. So then the question is, so what do you want your account of conditionals to be? If it wants to capture reasoning or good reasoning, and these people have this intuition, you have to say something about that, because you don't have an account that prohibits that. Or you want maybe to just say, maybe there is a threefold decision. So you have on the one hand truth conditions, on the other hand you have acceptability intuitions, and then you have the way people in everyday life count as good reasoning about reasons.
Good. Nice. So you worried about this?
Yes.
Okay. That's not phi therefore phi. That's if phi then phi.
Yeah.
Okay. And the two things are very different in this.
Yeah.
Right? Even when phi therefore phi holds, it's because it's just valid in classical propositional logic. It's even valid in the logic here. So phi therefore phi, that's fine.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, that's different.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
So
still by case, I think you don't rule out that the case I was thinking of.
no, I don't. But the thing is, if you buy a suppositional account of conditionals, that should come out phi, right? Because supposing phi, surely phi holds under the supposition. Isn't that right? Wouldn't you buy that?
Yeah, but then you are changing I think you are modifying the attitude. So you are, no? So I think you can account for intuitions about these cases in terms of content or different attitudes. I can suppose or imagine. So you give an account in terms of specific attitudes you have towards this.
Well, that just says that this is perfectly acceptable.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think that people do accept that.
Yeah.
And the probabilistic account that I proposed to you is just in the ballpark of suppositional probabilistic accounts of conditions, which are based on the Ramsey test.
Yeah.
All we do, the technicalities are a bit complicated, but all we do is we add our beloved topics to capture a kind of relevance, right?
Okay.
And account for the cases which are not covered by Adam's thesis, because the conditional probability can be high, but still the conditional comes out unacceptable, right? Now, that's the background philosophical story. And in this story, that just says that, well, supposing phi, of course, we judge phi very likely under the supposition. Anybody does that. So the probability of phi conditional on phi, or under the supposition of phi, is going to be 1. Okay. There's some literature on partial supposition, where you can partially suppose something. So you suppose something, but in some sense you don't fully accept it. I'm not familiar with that here. I know it's out there. But in the standard account, when you suppose phi, within the supposition, you give it just probability 1. And then, of course, the conditional probability of it on itself is going to be 1. Okay. Yeah. And that's how people think. Next, we don't even want to say that this is strictly connected with reasoning as a process. So when we claim in the paper, in the chapter of the book, that this is in line with how people reason with conditionals, we just mean that it's in line with those experiments, which we mentioned in the paper and in the book. And those experiments are just formulated in terms of how acceptable people find the inferences. So some inferences have a high degree of acceptability for people, according to those experiments. And those are exactly those which are validated by the result. And the inferences that have a low degree of acceptability are exactly the ones which are invalidated by our account. But if you wanna see exactly what those people have been asked, they have been asked for their judgments of acceptability. So they have been asked things like, oh, given that this premise is acceptable for you, will you find the conclusion acceptable? So it's not clear that they're testing processes of reasoning rather than something else. They just ask for intuitive judgment on the acceptability of something, given that something else is acceptable. So I don't know if we're capturing reasoning processes, we're just capturing what people find acceptable and unacceptable.
I see.
Yeah. So it became in a sense more modest. When I say we capture how people reason with conditionals, I just mean differences which are validated by the logic are the ones which are found highly acceptable in those experiments. And the differences which are invalidated by the logic are the differences which are not found highly acceptable. That's it. We don't claim, oh, those are exactly the inferences that match real process of reasoning and so on. We don't claim that much.
Okay, Maria has a follow-up.
I have now the question of whether there is the same idea of acceptability, the one that agents are reporting and the one that you are capturing.
Good.
Because ideally, you are capturing the preservation of the acceptability from the premises to the conclusion, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know whether in the experiments agents really understood that acceptability, or if they were just reflecting epistemic transparency about how to go from a set of premises to a conclusion.
Good. Yeah, there's an answer to that. That's what I got from Tim. When I gave him this answer, I said, how do you know that these people understood what they got asked? That's news. So, Eagle Group has carried out another test experiment. They got the same experimental subjects, and they have a test to check that they understood acceptability in the right way, as rational believability and so on, not confused with assertability or pragmatic moves and so on. I can give you the details of the paper in which they have the control experiment. So if you don't buy the experiment itself, and you don't buy the control experiments, which gives you robust evidence that people understood pretty clearly acceptability the way I phrased it for you, well then, I don't know what else to say. But yeah, they were careful because they even carried out this control experiment to make sure that people understood acceptability exactly in the right way. So it's rational believability or something in connection to that.
Thanks.
I think Simon comes next.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was wondering what happens in the case of a conditional, like if P, then it's not the case that P and not P on your accounts. So your account would say that's acceptable, right? The relevant conditional probability is 1, is the consequence of tautology, and it's on topic. Topicality is preserved. Just wondering whether that's the right results.
No, I don't think it is. So that's right. Point taken. And that's the same problem that Luis came up with the other way.
With the explosion thing.
Yeah, with the quasi explosion. Yeah, that's not it, right? And that shows that the setting is still too classical or conservative, even the probabilistic setting. It's the same problem. The problem with topics as I combine them so far, so until the other week, I combined them with standard normal model logic. Now I just combine them with standard probabilistic conditional logical Adams. And in both cases, you get that unwanted side effect because everything works as it shouldn't work when the consequent of the other bit is both necessarily true or having probability 1 and on topic with respect to the antecedent or the first bit. And I agree that that's a problem. It's a problem in both cases due to the fact that the underlying thing to which we are adding subject matters is standard. Last week it was standard model logic. Now it's standard Adams probability logic. So yeah, I completely buy the point.
So the solution is just to switch the underlying logic.
So in the case of the normal model setting that I presented to you last week, yes, I think you switch to a non-normal model logic. Which one? We are experimenting with first degree entailment, very famous weak paraconsistent logic. In the probabilistic case, I have no idea. Anyway, good point.
Please, Moises.
Thank you. Thanks, Franz. So it's related to Simon's question. So for example, take the Sherlock Holmes case, right? So you have, I think that in your view, correct me if I'm right, you say that because of the topicality constraint, and to if fails, but I suppose that and to if is preserved when you have when you're on topic, right? So if you're on topic, and to if, like if you know there's
Wait, what's on topic with respect to what?
So for example, you have a conjunction, Sherlock Holmes, sorry, Watson was shot in the leg and Watson was shot only once. And then you have Watson was shot in the leg and Watson was shot only once, then Watson was shot in the leg, for example. Watson was shot in the leg and Watson was shot only once, then if Watson was shot in the leg, then Watson was shot only once. Will that conditional be acceptable in your
Depends on if the topic of the consequent is included in the topological closure of the topic of the antecedent.
Right.
I don't know. At times there's a lot of data context in which it won't, and so that's gonna fade.
Right, but okay, so humor me just for a brief second, right? So suppose you are thinking about something like an inconsistent story. So for example, in the Sherlock Holmes case, you know that Watson was shot only once, according to the story, but also Watson was shot in the leg and Watson was shot in the shoulder. Like, you know, in different parts of the story, it says all of those two things, right? So suppose you have that Watson was shot in the only once and Watson was shot in the leg. What about then of the conditional Watson was shot only once and Watson was shot in the leg? If Watson was shot only once and Watson was shot in the leg, then Watson wasn't shot on the shoulder. So in that conditional, it seems that you want acceptability to be preserved from the premises to the conclusion. But it seems that if you accept the antecedent of the conditional, then the acceptability of the consequent should be lower. Or maybe I'm just confused. So I just wanted to see what, again, this might just be a confusion on my part, but I just wanted to see what you have to say.
Why the acceptability of the consequent will be lower?
Because Watson was shot only once. So, and if Watson was shot only once and Watson was shot in the leg, then the acceptability of Watson was shot on the shoulder should be lower.
Oh, okay. But I mean, that's an inconsistent context.
Right.
So one of the background assumptions is the inconsistent one, that it was shot on the shoulder.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then it doesn't go down anymore. So I'm in the context of the assumptions, the background assumptions which are relevant, and on top of to assess the condition, you're going to have that information too, of course. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Of course, it's inconsistent information, but then it's not going to be lower anyway. It just works in a strange way because you are in a context in which you're given inconsistent information. So you're given information that it was shot only once in the leg, and also that it was not shot only once. in the line and in the shoulder. But any information that was shot in the shoulder is part of the background assumptions which are relevant for the assessment of the conditional. And so the probability of that consequence is not low anymore. It's a crazy situation, but that's crazy just because you have a weird inconsistent information situation. So it's just weirdness in, weirdness out in this.
Thank you.
Okay, I lost track for a bit. I mean, there was a question by Miguel Ángel, but I think someone around here raised Ricardo. I think you were before, I just wasn't sure.
Yeah, actually, my question is fairly similar to Santiago's and Maria's. I should have raised, I think, and probably you already answered it, but let me try. So what if Adams proposes the following Pyrrhic victory for his view?
Yeah.
He may say, well, perhaps when you present subjects with the conditional, if Brexit triggered a recession, then Jupiter is a planet. They think that the conditional is bad because they cannot think of any context where one would like to assert something like that. Like it wouldn't serve any conversational purpose, a conditional like that. But then what they are tracking is something about assertability, not about acceptability. And further, you could claim, well, your view is a very good view, but it's a view about what's assertable insofar as the topic is concerned, whereas Adams's view is about acceptability. And I'm saying this will be a Pyrrhic victory because you may claim, well, if that's the case, then the notion of acceptability is not very interesting. What the interesting notion is the other one, no? Assertability as far as topic.
Yeah, that's not the reply that I would give. I would say that that's just the wrong account of acceptability. I mean, do we really think that those conditionals are acceptable? But you want people to accept?
No, but look,
I think they're just unacceptable. And I think we accept in the privacy of our mind before we perform. So, yeah, take this one. Let's take this example. I just find this unacceptable. It's not that I find it acceptable, but I don't want to assert it for conversational purposes. That's just unacceptable to me. I'm not. Maybe you not share intuition, and then I don't know what to say about that. But I think that we find this unacceptable before we have said any word to anyone, before we are in any conversational context. I can be completely on my own and find that conditional plainly, and I find it plainly unacceptable.
Probably you won't like this way of replying, but what if Adam says, you know, it's similar to validity. When you teach intro to logic, you can present valid inferences to students, and there will be, you know, inferences with false premises that are valid, and students will be like, oh, that's terrible what they're thinking. That's not a valid argument.
Yeah.
And you know what they're thinking is like you would never want to use an argument like that in a real conversation, because that's not to say that the argument is not valid. Of course, you may side with the students and say, no, that's really a problem with those arguments. But
nice. Yeah. So yeah, I think so. If somebody claims that, one will be committed to coming up with an error theory for our intuitions of acceptability. So I claim, and again, those experiments seem to confirm that lots of people will just find this kind of stuff unacceptable. Okay. And also those inferences, the corresponding inferences that I mentioned and so on, it's just gonna be found unacceptable. So if you don't buy that, you need to come up with some kind of error theory which shows that our intuitions of acceptability are massively wrong. And it's not even clear how you do that, because so it's not like having an error theory for intuitions of acceptability on something different from acceptability. You need to come up with an error theory for acceptability itself. Up to you.
But again, I think, and I haven't run any experiments, but my bet was that the people that were asked these questions were really tracking something closer to the notion of assertability. Mm-hmm. They don't like those conditionals just because there's no conversation where you would like to assert.
That's what I mentioned before.
That
They carried out this control experiment just to rule out this case. They went to a subject and say, I'm not asking you what you would find acceptable, appropriate in a conversational context, and so on. Okay. Would you accept these claims where acceptability is like a rational believability? And people can say no. People said no. Okay. They asked lots of questions, control questions, to make sure that people understood what they were asked, and that they were asked questions in terms of what's rationally acceptable for you in the privacy of your head, independently from any communication purposes, what is appropriately acceptable, and so on. So that's a very nice film, which is designed exactly to rule out this reinterpretation of what the experimental subjects are being asked.
Yeah, brilliant.
Okay, Maria.
I just want to maybe press the issue or be mistaken about it. Let's agree on the fact that the people who conduct the experiments and the people who respond to the experiments were in agreement on what acceptability meant for them. But I wonder how much your approach reconstructs that idea and not only reconstructs the idea of preserving acceptability. Because I can say that I don't find an inference acceptable. I can say that I don't find a claim acceptable, and that doesn't necessarily mean the same, right? Because if I deny myself to accept a schema of inference, that means that I have really epistemic access to what is going on over there. And so let's say that they say that they don't find the set of things that are there altogether acceptable, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they deny the inference, or I don't see clearly that what you're doing is actually reconstructing.
So it's two different things.
Yes,
So people are asked about the acceptability of indicatives, and people are asked about certain inferences that involve indicatives. Okay. And sometimes they find indicatives unacceptable, also when the corresponding conditional probability is right. Okay. And sometimes they have an inference such that the premises have a certain degree of acceptability for them, but the conclusion doesn't reach that degree of acceptability. Or the other way around, if you want to phrase it in terms of unacceptability. Those are what the experiments are about. So it's not, people are not asked about the acceptability of inferences involved in the conditional. They're asked about the acceptability of the premises and the acceptability of the conclusion. Yeah. And they also asked about the acceptability of individual indicative conditionals. But it's not that they ask questions about the acceptability of the inferences involved in the conditions as a whole. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, now we have a question by Miguel.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question of your account of relevance, because the way you present logical relevance is in a semantical way, but traditional accounts of relevance, for example, effective use, improve, and observer principle, are syntactic.
Okay, good.
So my question is there any bridge between your account of relevance and traditional ones, or maybe are you in off topic with relevant traditions?
So it's good that you spoke in the plural, because there's more than one account of relevance in the ballpark of relevant logic, broadly conceived. How many there are? There's the actual use in inference account of that. There is relevance structured semantically, like in the Rautley-Meyer semantics for relevant logic and so on. I don't think the account that I proposed here is specific to the probabilistic logic that I gave you now, because the relevance component is the usual topicality account that I already proposed to you the previous week when we were just doing model logic. Well, a connection is that I'm asking for a certain overlap between antecedent and consequent in good conditionals, right? Except that, my good conditionals are all conditionals that satisfy the famous or infamous variable sharing property. Because if they're good for me, then they're also gonna satisfy the VSP. But there are some conditionals which satisfy the VSP, but which are not good conditionals for me. So the kind of relevance that I'm proposing is even stricter than the one you find in the relevant, in those relevance logic accounts which are formulated either by using the VSP or by using the Routledge-Meyer semantics, which gives you logics and conditions that fully satisfy the variable sharing property. I'm not sure about how this account connects to the actual use in inference account, because I haven't thought about that yet, but that's a good point.
Okay.
There's a big difference, namely that, as you see, all these accounts are essentially two components, right? When I gave you the model logic, it was standard normal model logic, and then I added the subject matters or the topics. Here it's Adam's probabilistic conditional logic, and then we added the topics again. Okay. Now, relevant logicians, I mean mainstream relevant logicians, didn't like it that way, and that's why Routledge bashed a certain small family of relevance logics, which were built in a similar way. Normal model logic and a relevance filter. Yes. And if you read Graham Priest's textbook, he says that much. When he introduces relevant logic, he says, oh, relevance logic is not just classical or normal model logic plus a filter, right? We want relevance to pop out of the consideration of a suitable range of circumstances, which are basically impossible words, and so on and so forth. So in that respect, this account is different in spirit from the mainstream relevant account. This is really two components. Yeah.
Thank you.
We still have 5 more minutes, and I don't know if there were any other questions that I might have missed.
I have a question about intuitions. What's the role of intuitions in the framework? For example, do you think that intuitions are evidence for one theory or another? And what would happen if intuitions, people have different, have intuitions that don't support your theory?
So, is referring specifically to what I talked about today, or are you talking in general of the stuff I tried to sell also last week and the week before? The whole thing. Good. Wow, that's difficult. So, I think that in general, and that's just standard way of doing semantics. Okay, you cannot but start by taking into account competent speakers' intuitive judgments of synonymy, antonymy, entailment, incompatibility, presupposition, and so on. And the rhetorical question is, where else are you going to start from? Axioms, a priori intuitions. Like we look at the Platonic heaven of semantics. There's not that, nobody thought that way. If you open any standard textbook of semantics, it's gonna tell you, Cherky and McConnell, or whatever. You're going to say the task of semantics is to capture competent speakers' intuitions of entailment, synonymy, antonymy, and so on. Right? I think that should be anyone's starting point. Of course, everybody agrees that we cannot capture all the intuitions. Why? Well, because people are going to have inconsistent intuitions. Everybody knows that. Okay? People's intuitions can be all over the place. And so that's gonna. So the task of doing semantics systematically inevitably is gonna involve simplifications and idealizations and intuitions you cannot account for and so on. Your theory is gonna give explanations and predictions, and you're gonna test them against the intuitions again. And sometimes you have to revise your theory in the light of intuitions. Maybe you're looking for some kind of reflective equilibrium, where you fine-tune the intuitions in the light of the theory, and you fine-tune the theory in the light of the intuitions. I think that's the way to go in semantics in general. What else? In this case, I spoke also about experiments that tested people's intuitions of acceptability. And I did that now, but not last week, because here, as I said at the end of the talk, here we're dealing with acceptability. And I think for acceptability, what people find that intuitively acceptable is especially important. That's why it's good that there's a bunch of empirical results on acceptability that I think support our logic.
Are there any further questions? Okay, Moises.
So just one super quick question. You mentioned something very interesting about being skeptical that even classical probability wouldn't be able to deal with conditionals that involve necessary truths or necessary falsehoods and so on. So I was wondering, for example, if you have a conditional like, so suppose you have the following conditional: if Gödel's completeness theorem were false,
But that's not a factor.
right? Okay, so I don't know, maybe I don't know if mathematics were if mathematics were not what if mathematics is not incomplete, then Hilbert's dream is realizing. Something like that. So my question is just I'm not putting this forward as a problematic point, but I just want to see how you think your theory of conditionals tries to understand the relevance relations there.
So the probability of the consequent on the antecedent is super high, right? And it's on topic, and so it comes out acceptable, which it is. That sounds very acceptable to me.
Yeah.
If mathematics is complete, then Hilbert's dream is realizing.
No, I think that's actually good. Like the fact that you can actually, because that's something that people say. Like when people are talking about the history of mathematics,
I find that very acceptable. It's a different question whether that's true, but I said nothing on truth. Yeah,
right.
That's why I insisted on formulating that in the indicative mood and not in the subjunctive. Because nothing of this is straightforwardly carried on to the subjunctives.
Right.
We're also working on a relevant probabilistic account of the acceptability of subjunctives. But for that one, we're not using Popper functions or conditional probabilities at all. We're using another kind of probabilistic relief revision due to Genius Lewis and called imaging. That's in the same paper, Probability of Conditional and Conditional Probabilities, where he comes out with a triviality result. He invented a different non-Bayesian way to update probability distributions, which he called imaging. That's an awesome probability revision probabilistic procedure, which has been neglected even by patients. But not everyone, because a few people have worked on that. So it's going to be a similar story, but it doesn't use conditional probabilities. It uses imaging probabilities, because that we think works better for counterfactuals.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Franz, for yet another wonderful talk.
Thanks.